In the Middle Ages, if you had the Viking hand, that didn't make you a great warrior. Quite the contrary, it meant you suffered from a very specific condition called the Dupuytren's disease. This is an ancient affliction of unknown origin defined by a shortening, thickening and fibrosis of the palmar fascia, producing a deformity of a finger. Tradition has it that the disease originated with the Vikings, who spread it throughout northern Europe and beyond as they traveled and intermarried. After being present for hundreds of years, Dupuytren's disease was named in the 19th century after a famous French surgeon who in fact was not the first to describe it. So what is the Viking disease? On December 5th, 1831, Baron Guillaume Dupuytren delivered a lecture on permanent retractions of the flexed fingers, which was published under the title Leçons sur la rétraction permanente des doigts. To this day, the condition bears his name, despite the fact that history shows that in the 17th century and later Sir Astley Cooper in 1818 had already described a similar condition. Born in 1777, Guillaume Dupuytren was generally acknowledged as the greatest French surgeon of the 19th century. The English journal The Lancet named him in his lifetime the most erudite and accomplished surgeon in Europe. An ambitious man, he came from relatively humble origins and in his later years was created baron by Louis XVIII. He would now be called a draft dodger since his colleagues of the Faculty of Medicine in Paris arranged his deferment from the draft of Napoleon's armies. Dupuytren's name has been associated as an eponym with at least 12 different diseases, fractures, surgical procedures, and instruments. Despite his aversion to writing, his students documented and published all of his teachings in local medical journals. For his era, Dupuytren demonstrated a scientific and inquisitive mind, as well as a compassionate approach to medicine, visiting his patients daily. Dupuytren's disease typically begins with the appearance of a nodule on the palm, usually along the line of the ring or the small finger. Initially, one hand is affected, often not the dominant one, before the other hand may develop the characteristic nodule and finger contracture. The condition usually starts at the metacarpophalangeal joint, eventually involving the proximal interphalangeal joint as well. Essentially, Dupuytren's disease is a hand condition that causes the fingers to become fixed in a bent position. The underlying tissue of the palm, known as the palmar fascia, forms small, hard nodules that progressively thicken. Over time, this leads to the development of thickened cords or bands that extend into the fingers, causing them to bend inward towards the palm. As the disease progresses, it becomes increasingly difficult to straighten the fingers, and in long-term cases, the fingers may become permanently bent. While the condition tends not to be painful, this flexion contracture of the fingers can make day-to-day life very difficult. Simple actions like putting your hands in your pockets, putting on gloves, washing your face, or shaking hands with someone can become hard to do. There may be some discomfort when holding or gripping. And now let's answer the second question. Was it truly a disease of the Vikings? Well, actually, not really. But we can understand why it got the name. If you take into account the huge migratory patterns of the Norse in the early Middle Ages, from Iceland to Spain, from Baghdad to Canada, and the genetic likelihood of this condition with people of Scandinavian origin, if you had been a medical doctor in the Middle Ages, you would have made the connection. This is something Vikings would have carried with them. It would also have been quite terrible had you wanted to build a boat or wield a sword. It would have rendered you pretty much useless. And there was also little to do about it. But now we know that the disease is also quite widespread in the Mediterranean and the Balkans, and it results from a mix of genetic predisposition. It is recurrent with males over 50 with family history and modifiable factors like smoking, alcohol, or manual work. Honestly, the Vikings suffered from much more severe diseases than a malformation of the hand, from tooth infections to ringworm infestations, always a pleasant topic I dealt with in a previous video. There is nevertheless a very interesting historical aspect about this disease. Researchers at the Karolinska Institutet from Sweden have used data from over 7,000 affected individuals to look for genetic risk factors for the disease. The findings, which have been published in Molecular Biology and Evolution, show that 3 of the strongest risk factors are inherited from the Neanderthals. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia until about 40,000 years ago, when they were replaced by modern humans. Before Neanderthals disappeared, they mixed with modern humans. As a result, between 1 and 2% of the genomes of people with roots outside of Africa come from Neanderthals. Since Dupuytren's contracture is rarely seen in individuals of African descent, could gene variants from Neanderthals partially explain why people outside of Africa are affected? Turns out, yeah. The researchers used data from 3 large clinical cohorts in the US, UK, and Finland, which allowed them to compare the genomes of more than 7,000 sufferers and about 640,000 healthy controls. They identified 61 genetic factors for the Dupuytren's contracture. 3 of these were inherited from Neanderthals, and these included the second and the third most important risk factors. The study is further evidence that the intermingling between Neanderthals and our ancestors has important consequences for the prevalence of some diseases, particularly among certain groups. So, medieval Scandinavians suffered more often because their ancestors did too, following the intermingling with the Neanderthals. This isn't the first time that Neanderthal genes left behind in modern humans have been linked to disease. A 2014 study in the journal Nature tied several present-day human diseases, such as diabetes, Crohn's disease, lupus, and cirrhosis, to Neanderthal DNA remnants. But the link between Dupuytren's disease and these Neanderthal gene variants is especially strong. 2 of the genetic mutations were the second and third, most strongly associated with the odds of having the disease, respectively. Actually, severe COVID-19 is the only other disease that has been found to have such strong genetic connections with Neanderthals. People with roots outside Africa have about 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genome. So, statistically, by random chance, you would expect Neanderthal DNA to collectively account for around 2% of the genetic risk of the disease. But 8.4% is explained by Neanderthal gene flow, since it is much more than expected by chance alone. So, although Vikings had little to do with the disease, it's always interesting to explore such myths and misunderstandings. If you'd like to hear more about the Viking Age and similar topics, hit the subscribe button and enjoy. This was Irina, historian and teacher. Till next time, and all the best.